Welcome to Global Sociology Live. We are very pleased to continue this series of discussions today with Amita Baviskar, who is a professor of sociology at Delhi University. Next week, we're going to be joined by Eric Wright, who will be talking about real utopias as a way of meeting the challenges of global capitalism. But today, we're very lucky to have with us Professor Baviskar, who is going to be discussing social movements that address environmental issues in India. And Dr. Baviskar has done extensive research on struggles around the environment and conflicts over natural resources. Among her many publications, she's perhaps best known for her book, In the Belly of the River, where she focuses on protests that emerge in response to forms of displacement caused by the construction of dams in the Narmada Valley. And more recently, her work has come to focus on struggles around urban space and the use of environmentalist discourses in urban restructuring efforts in Delhi. She is the co-editor of one of the most prominent sociology journals in India, Contributions to Indian Sociology. And she's received numerous awards for her research, including most recently the Infosys Prize for Social Science, which is one of the most prestigious awards in India. And in addition to her work at Delhi University, she's also held a number of visiting professorships at universities here in the US, including Cornell, Yale, Stanford, as well as here at UC Berkeley. And Dr. Baviskar will be continuing today our conversation on counter movements that emerge in response to the forms of dispossession and impoverishment associated with neoliberalism. But she is actually making a very important intervention in this discussion. While our previous guests, Peter Evans and Eddie Webster, focused on highlighting the potential for global counter movements, Professor Baviskar reminds us to think critically about these struggles and to pay close attention to their class dynamics and the interests that they reflect. And in particular, she pushes us to think critically about the environmentalist movement in India, where she identifies what she calls bourgeois environmentalism, which advances the interests of middle and upper classes rather than those who suffer forms of dispossession and displacement. And so, in other words, Professor Baviskar makes this important intervention by reminding us to temper our optimism about the potential of counter movements with a critical skepticism that really pays careful attention to the fact that social movements can not only resist the effects of neoliberalism, but also at times can also reproduce the very inequalities and hazards that they seek to address. So please please join me in welcoming Dr. Amita Baviskar.
Thanks, Lali. Should I start now?
Yes, please do. Yes.
Okay. It's a pleasure, first of all, and an honor to be a part of this group. And I'm really delighted to be able to do this, though I'm a bit nervous because of this sort of virtual thing that we have going here. But let me begin by saying that I came to study the politics around environment and development primarily as an environmentalist myself. And my interest in studying conflicts around displacement in the Narmada Valley were really to do with the way in which the people in the valley made claims to place, fighting against a large dam that would displace them, in terms of their superior use of the land, in terms of ecological sustainability. So in that sense, the anti-dam movement in the Narmada Valley made very strong claims to being an environmental movement, a movement that spoke out for patterns of development that would both be socially just as well as ecologically sustainable. And in that sense, the movement was the epitome of what's being called environmentalism of the poor, where a concern for the environment is not something which is the monopoly of people who are already well off and for whom the environment is part of larger lifestyle. But it's really about people for whom the environment matters in terms of their everyday subsistence. And in that sense, the anti-dam movement was very much a part of the way in which environmentalism in the global south has been linked to questions of social justice from the very start. And I should mention that, in fact, in rural India at present, there continue to be huge numbers of movements still of that kind, where people are making claims to place, but are also making claims to better manage the environment. And these are mainly movements which are protesting against the takeover of land for mining projects, dams, expressways, industrial estates, nuclear plants, or in very many cases, actually just simply speculation.
Dr. Baviskar, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there seems to be some movement on the screen from your end. I'm not sure why. I don't know if you're able to see it, but it's zooming in and out as you speak.
Yes, I know. My camera on my laptop does do that, and I have no idea.
Okay. So there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it just seems to be slightly unhinged in the sense that I think it doesn't focus too well or something, but I can't actually fix it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
No. So please, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, I hope it's not too distracting for you.
No,
fine.
it's
okay.
it's fine.
Okay,
We get different views of you every minute, so that's good.
Okay. You can pretend it's a movie or something. So as I was saying, that there've been a number of counter movements against the takeover of land for all kinds of development projects. And of course, this is not new because it goes back to the project of national development that India has been embarked on since the 1950s. But what is new is that a lot of the projects now are not state projects which are meant to build infrastructure, but are actually projects which are taking land away from small farmers and other people who use it and handing it over, transferring it straightforwardly to private corporations. And here the role of the state is a different one, because the state continues to use the idea of public purpose to acquire these lands, but now it's acquiring the land and handing them over to private interests. And this is a new development that has started happening since the 1990s, when India embarked on economic liberalization with more and more incentives to private firms to develop the economy ostensibly. But the project has really been the pursuit of economic growth at all costs. And this has in many ways reignited the land question because of the acceleration of land ownership transfers which have been going on. So in rural India, at least today, land is a site of major struggle. And this is a little bit ironic actually, because there is a major agrarian crisis going on in India just now. A crisis that's reflected in the fact that tens of thousands of farmers have committed suicide because they can no longer make ends meet. And so land as a means of making a livelihood is today less and less viable. But despite that, people continue to struggle for land and to try and hold on to it, both as security and as a means of subsistence, however precarious and small it might be, because it's the only means of subsistence that keeps them away from absolute dispossession. So social movements around land in rural India are today using new laws such as the Forest Rights Act to safeguard individual rights as well as community rights. And in their movements, they are able to combine the argument about social justice as well as ecological sustainability. But when we look at the urban case, while land continues to be the center of conflict in urban India, and issues of displacement and dispossession are at the core of it, we find that poor people in cities have not been able to stake a claim to land and have not been able to defend their rights to space, to shelter, to work, to sanitation, and to water. Cities have really been the epicenter of economic liberalization policies since the 1990s. economic growth and rising wealth have been concentrated in urban India. And with the land, with the deregulation of land, which has been happening as a result of these economic policies now, real estate prices have soared. And places that were thought of earlier as marginal, as bad places to live, places on the margins of railway lines, along water bodies, places which were wetlands, which were occupied by the poor, have now acquired a serious monetary value, and they are now regarded as property for redevelopment, as spaces for elite consumption. So there's a great appetite now in urban India for land, to acquire land at all costs. And this has led to a serious demand to exclude poor people who occupy these lands at present. Much of this land is now demanded by the middle class, which, because of economic liberalization, feels both empowered economically as well as entitled politically to demand world-class lifestyles, lifestyles of convenience and comfort, of the kind that you can have in, say, Singapore or London or New York, and they want to live in a city which gives them access to the labor of the poor for all the services that they provide. And yet they want an urban environment which is free of the presence of the poor. So the poor should be available, but at the same time invisible. And so there is this phenomenon that I describe as bourgeois environmentalism, which is the middle class pursuit of order, hygiene, and safety, which has mobilized the discourse of public interest and citizenship to voice civic concerns, but in a manner that does not include the city's poorer sections. And I describe in my work the way in which middle-class pursuit of environmental concerns in the public interest has been supported by the courts in India, the High Court and the Supreme Court both stepping in to decide on matters of public interest, but defining the public in a way that excludes and disenfranchises the poor. So we see that environmental causes in the urban context get interpreted very selectively. There is, for instance, in Delhi, there have been in the last 10 years now, major initiatives to clean up the city's air and water. And in the course of cleaning the city's air, manufacturing firms that employed anything, the numbers are hard to establish properly, but it does seem that something like 500,000 people actually lost jobs, and several hundreds of thousands others were also displaced as a result of manufacturing firms being shut down. And these were mainly small firms, often operating out of small households and so on. All of this in order to clean up the city's air. In the course of cleaning up Delhi's water, the river Yamuna that runs through the city, poor squatters who lived on the banks of the river were also displaced. And in all, the displacement from the shut factories, the loss of jobs that is, and the displacement from the removal of slums affected at least 2 million people. Now, the irony here, and it's actually more than irony, it's actually tragic, is the fact that if you look at what causes air pollution or water pollution in Delhi, the much more important contributors to these problems are the private vehicles of generally well-to-do people, which create air pollution. And in the case of water pollution, it's mainly domestic sewage that's coming from the well-to-do residential areas that actually have sewage connections. So we see a selective interpretation and a selective targeting of responsibilities in terms of environmental problems. And there is a consistent logic to this in the way in which both the problem as well as its solution are identified. And we see that this brings together the question of pollution with that of poverty. So poor people are seen not just as the creators of pollution and therefore as environmental villains, but they're themselves seen as targets of what should be gotten rid of. So if you get rid of poor people, you get rid of pollution. And this very much fits in what Mary Douglas said about dirt, that dirt is not something which is intrinsically dirty, but dirt is actually matter out of place. And in urban India, it does certainly seem that the poor are regarded as matter out of place and therefore as dirty, as people who need to be removed. And in that sense, we see that there is this big contrast between the claims to land and space and livelihoods being made between rural India and urban India. That in the case of urban India, we see that social justice claims are on far more fragile grounds, and I'd later like to talk about why that's so. And we see that arguments about ecological sustainability and environmental justice have really been seized by the middle classes in a way that disenfranchises poorer people from being able to say that what they do and what their needs are in the city really deserves to be both appreciated as well as planned for and accommodated within the urban context. So the sort of questions I'm interested in asking are, what has happened to what was essentially understood as a progressive movement, as an environmentalism of the poor in the urban context? So what is it about the environment that allows other people, especially powerful social groups, to claim to speak for the environment? What is it that allows them to claim to safeguard the public interest, defining the public in such a way that poor people get excluded? And how do bourgeois attempts to monopolize environmental causes and public concerns run counter to the needs and aspirations of the poor? Is, I think, a very important question to look at. And thinking more politically in terms of the prospects for mobilizing, I think one has to look carefully at the challenges to working class struggles in urban India, and to try and understand the way in which citizenship gets constructed differently in the rural as well as urban contexts. And I think it's very important here to also try and trace the role of the state as a key mediator in these kinds of conflicts, and the different role that the state has played in rural conflicts as well as in urban ones. So for me, the project really is both a comparative one, to try and understand how economic liberalization plays out differently in rural and urban India, but the way in which these kinds of economic and social processes also affect the politics of recognition and the ability that people have to come together and mobilize collectively in order to be able to challenge what today are really very, very massive and fast processes of social transformation, which for them mean dispossession and displacement. So let me stop with that, and I'll be happy to answer questions or elaborate more on what I mean if you ask questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baviskar, for so clearly laying all of that out. And our students have also been reading some of your work, several of your articles, which generated a great deal of discussion and interest on Monday. And so I know that they do actually have some questions they would like to pose for you. So who would like to begin? Catherine.
Hi. I just wanted to say, a lot of us, after we had read some of your articles, were kind of surprised at how much some of the things that you were describing going on in Delhi kind of resonated with things we had seen elsewhere in the world, in our own country. And I'm just wondering, because your work is looking so specifically at India, how much you think that this sort of process is something that's specific to this particular time and place, or if it's sort of a general process that happens throughout the world in different places. And I'm particularly curious about if you think this has anything to do with, India's kind of position as, this sort of emerging, developing country, versus, and if there's any sort of divide between the global north and the global south, or if this is just a general trend.
Yeah. I don't claim any first-hand knowledge of other contexts, but reading about what's been happening in, say, South Africa or Egypt or Mexico and so on, I think what is really striking is the way in which these processes are similar. And I think it's not a coincidence that they're similar. They happen to come about at a particular moment when global capitalism is operating across the scale in different countries and different contexts. And in many ways, the kind of lifestyles, aspirations, patterns of consumption that we happen to see in metros across the world, I think are very, very similar. Partly because there is a common model of consumption around which they tend to be built. And this is a model of consumption that has spread itself around the world, and it's very visible when you go to metros and see the same stores, the same brand names, but also increasingly the same patterns in terms of people eating out. There's a convergence in terms of what the idea of a good life or having a good time is all about. So I think what happens in, say, in Lima maybe, as well as in say, Jakarta, is now not as dissimilar as it might have been, say, a generation ago. Within that, I think economic policies which result in globalization have also deepened the kind of social inequalities that already existed, but which have, I think, become far sharper in certain contexts. In India, it's very much the case that while there has been, for a lot of people, the experience of some improvement in their life chances, especially in their life expectancies, the gap between the rich and the poor has increased enormously. There are now at least 20 people who figure in the list, at least 20 Indian citizens who figure in the list of the 100 most wealthy people in the world. And at the same time, we know that about 40% of India's population still lives on less than $1 a day. So, given that these patterns of increasing disparity are not just confined to India, but also exist in other countries, I think there will be some resonances between what I described for India and what exists in other places. I know that when I read Teresa Caldera's book, City of Walls, which is about Sao Paulo and the creation of gated communities there, I was immediately struck because the same phenomenon of people putting up gates, of having guards at the entrance that then regulate who comes in and goes out, is very much increasing in India as well, in all major cities. So there is the emergence, I think, of a global middle class, a middle class that is in some ways anchored in the specificities of its own national or regional context, but at the same time, which is now mobile and is able to partake of consumption in similar ways across the world. And I think the role of the media in also sort of educating people's sense of what is desirable is, of course, crucially important in the circulation of ideas.
More questions? Sandra.
Hi. I'm really interested in I would like to know more how the way that people in Delhi accept these things. For example, okay, they build a bridge for pedestrians, thinking not of the pedestrians. They don't think about, and I think you described this in your article. They're not thinking about building bridges or flyovers for public interest, but for certain kind of people. But I want to know why these people accept this, and I think that probably it's because an informal economy develops in this chaos, and they see these things as opportunities for them to survive. So, for example, in Lima, when they build bridges for pedestrians, I ask people, what do you think about this? You don't have a car, you walk to work, you ride your bike, what do you think? And they're like, oh, now we can go sell candy or sell bread on these, in these bridges. It's actually an opportunity for us. So when I read your articles, I was thinking of that time. This happened last year when I was in Lima. And I just want to know, what do you think? Do you think that people are just consenting because they think, well, this is the status quo, this is what's happening in my city, in Delhi, and this is how it's going to be, and I'm going to take advantage of this informal economy that develops? Or, since you're from Delhi, maybe you can tell us more about.
Yeah. You're right that in some cases, some patterns of development which might be capital intensive and intended for the upper classes actually do open up some opportunities for poorer people. And in the case of Delhi, I think one really good instance of this is the metro. The metro is a very big infrastructure project, extremely expensive. But what the metro has actually enabled is the proliferation of cycle rickshaws. Because in order to reach the metro, you have to travel often short distances, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers. And a lot of people take a cycle rickshaw up to the metro station and then board the train. So that's why if you talk to poorer people who can't actually afford to go by the metro and who may in some cases have been displaced by the metro construction, they would actually say that it's a good thing because it does allow us to earn a living by ferrying people back and forth. But I think the even more powerful way in which there is overall not just acceptance for these kinds of large projects often that exclude poor people, but in fact admiration and celebration of these projects is that the vision of development that they embody is a very, very seductive one. And even people who are being marginalized by the kind of infrastructure development that's been happening, the flyovers, the bridges, the building up along the riverfront that displaced a lot of poor squatters who lived along the margins. All of them are developments that people in some ways, even poor people, said, well, this is what cities are going to be like. And this is nice. This looks good. So there is a way in which that aesthetic has now become all pervasive and is regarded as a desirable thing for people to have. And there's very interesting work by, in fact, Berkeley PhD Asher Gertner, who's looked at these posters that people put up in their homes. And these posters are often luridly colored pictures of sort of idealized landscapes. And all of these idyllic landscapes have this beautiful little cottage in them. So, and that cottage actually looks like something as if it's in the Swiss Alps, and it's completely unconnected with Indian realities. But there's a way in which these images circulate, and they fit. They come to signify people's aspirations in terms of what is the good life, what the city should look like. So even as there might be some people who are interested in the new opportunities that come up as a result of these new infrastructure projects, I think there are far larger numbers who are displaced, and yet they are unable to muster up their opposition to the kinds of displacement that they're experiencing, because the overall seduction of this model of development is really powerful. And I noticed this among even pedestrians who are actively, inconvenienced by the way the flyovers are built. People like my mother, who happens to now be close to 80, absolutely fumes at the way that she can't cross the road anymore, unless she walks for a kilometer, because there's no place where pedestrians can cross safely. The traffic just zooms past really fast, and even she feels that, well, but this is now the way things are, and it's hard to change them. I think movements for the rights of pedestrians, movements for the rights of vendors and cycle rickshaws are all things that need to, in fact, come together. And so far, that's not happened. And I see small attempts to try and organize everybody who's been marginalized by these kinds of developments. And yet, I think these movements have a long way to go before they're able to actually persuade urban planners, politicians, that the rights of pedestrians, the rights of people who use the streets in terms of non-motorized traffic actually need to be respected. And this, I think, is something which is very, very slowly emerging in cities, but not on a scale where it's become powerful enough to actually challenge the way in which cities are being ordered and organized.
Thank you.
Michael.
So I'm a student now, Amita. Yeah, there are lots of comparative questions that immediately spring to mind. One is with Beijing. Now, you talk about your rickshaw drivers. I mean, it is amazing, where else in the world do you find in the capital city rickshaw drivers? Very few places, as far as I know. But, in Beijing, they had all these bicycles, right? And they just wiped them out of existence. You go to Beijing, you don't find bicycles anymore. Now, in some ways, of course, the rickshaw drivers have been, in a sense, successful in sustaining their occupation in Delhi. So I'm wondering if there is some specificity about Delhi and the way this hybridity that does coexist, the old and the new. I just wonder, continuing this question, this comparative question, what you think about this.
Yeah. Well, I think the key difference between Delhi and Beijing would be that in Delhi, people can come in legally. In Beijing, they can't, because the Chinese government has in place a whole series of regulations about movement. So you have a lot of illegal immigrants into Beijing, but I think my impression is that they are confined to the margins. And they certainly can't occupy space in the center of the city the way that cycle rickshaw pullers can in the case of Delhi. But having said that, I want to underline that the position of migrants in Delhi, or for that matter in any city in India, is quite precarious. And for me, that is the key difference between urban India and rural India, and the ability of poor people to successfully wage struggles to hold on to resources or to claim new resources for themselves. And so for me, the comparative question, given that my work has been in urban and rural India only, is to look at the bases for resistance and to try and understand the reasons why people in rural India are able to, against fairly overwhelming odds, wage at times successful struggles to hold on to their land. Whereas people in urban India, despite their large numbers, and in fact migration has transformed the demographics of cities like Delhi, as well as the overall culture of the place. Despite their numbers, people are not able to, in fact, challenge what are these really, really sweeping policies in terms of urban dispossession and the loss of jobs and so on. I think a key issue has been that of the lack of legal tenure in the urban case, that poor people are forced to squat on public lands because the government has made no provision at all for housing, for low-income housing, especially for people who come into the city to work. This lack of legal tenure means that people are always just scrambling to stay one step ahead of the evictions, and the ability to mobilize is always a bit tenuous. What complicates that further is the politics of recognition, because one of the key ways in which government policies end up dividing the poor is by stipulating a cut-off date. So if you can prove with documents that you were in the city before 1990, then you're entitled to a small parcel of land on the outskirts of the city that the government will lease to you for 5 years. But if you don't have those documents, then you're going to get nothing. Now, what this means is that whenever there's a particular community of slum dwellers that is threatened by eviction, the older residents, who are always the more stable, slightly better off ones, are afraid to jeopardize their chances of getting that small plot of land. And therefore, they're quite willing to work with the government to actually dismantle their homes and move away because they want to make sure that they get that little thing that the government is offering to them by way of compensation. Residents who have come after the cutoff date are therefore unable to collectively mobilize with other people in the community. And often for them, any kind of mobilization comes at great cost because they stand to lose their livelihood on a daily basis. And so often they're the first ones to simply pack up their stuff and go away and make temporary arrangements to go to the outskirts of the city. And so this, the way in which the government recognizes people's rights, in fact, tends to divide up the poor. and in a way disciplines them, because the older residents will not fight, and the ones who do want to stay on because there's nothing better to do, then find nowhere else to go, simply find that they have no basis upon which to come together collectively. I think part of the problem, and it varies from city to city. So if you look at Delhi has had far less of a history of collective mobilization than cities like, say, Kolkata or Mumbai, which are industrial cities, which have a history of working class struggles, which I think even today, when the cities have gone through a period of deindustrialization, still informs the ways in which people living in slums come together. But Delhi has not had that sort of a history, and I think being a capital city, it's always been open to a certain kind of political patronage that has not been the case in other cities. And finally, I'd like to say that when it comes to why urban protest has been so difficult, we have to recognize that because of the concentration of economic growth in cities, the model of growth and prosperity is visible around poor people all the time. And to the extent that they feel that they can participate in this prosperity, if not today, then in 10 years' time, or if they feel that their children can prosper in the future, to that extent, they become willing to actually put up with a great deal of hardship because they feel that the model of development and liberalization will someday at least speak to their aspirations. And I think it's that the power of contemporary capitalism as it's unfolding in India right now, as well as probably the challenge of capitalism right now, is the extent to which it is able to actually harness those dreams and keep people willing to play along. And I don't think this can be sustained for very long, and certainly it cannot be sustained for large sections of the population. So in that sense, I think there is a great deal of discontent and it's growing larger as people realize that that horizon for becoming better off, for leading a good life, seems to be forever receding. So I'm hopeful that urban India will see many of the challenges that have become so manifest in the rural context in the Indian case.
Thank you.
Questions?
Angelica.
Oh, Angelica.
Hello. You stated that development is a seductive force. So, in terms of globalization, in your papers, you alluded to social movements as through the discourse of environmentalism and being able to appreciate them because of their hybridity. So, I was wondering, how strong is the role of religion in shaping urban poor struggle?
Struggles by urban poor people?
Yeah, in terms of,
The role of religion isn't actually as conspicuous as one might expect to see in a country that is actually quite religious. In that sense, I think it's a situation that's rather different from the kind that, say, Mike Davis describes in his book Planet of Slums, where he talks about the rise of Pentecostalism in a lot of Latin American as well as Southeast Asian cities, where a form of millenarian religion becomes a way by which poor people make sense of their lives. I haven't found very much evidence of that, either millenarianism in different forms, be it Hindu or Christian or Muslim, in Indian cities. If I were to speculate, I'd say that perhaps one could argue that an overall Indian, but primarily Hindu culture of acceptance could be traced in the ways in which among poor people in India, you do not find the levels of anger and discontent and alienation that you find in other cities. I've always been struck by people pointing out that if you were to contrast Indian cities with places like Johannesburg, Mexico City, Karachi, you would find that these are cities where life is actively unsafe for well-to-do people. The fear of muggings, abductions, carjackings is huge. There are armed guards everywhere. In the Indian case, that's oddly enough not true at all. There are public places where people across classes can mingle relatively freely. Um, it's rare to come across armed guards outside people's homes or offices. There will be a security guard, but he's likely to be, unarmed. So it actually does often, puzzle one. Why is it that people are confronted by huge disparities? People who live everyday lives of extreme deprivation still continue to put up with, and not just put up with, but actually smile at a world that is full of adversity. Indian slums are not places full of, rage and alcoholism and disaffection. There are places where people manage to lead what seem to be meaningful lives. So one way of explaining that puzzle might be to trace it not so much to religion, but to a larger cultural attitude of accepting one's place and doing one's best within that. But it's not something that I think is fully explanatory in itself. I mean, for me, this remains a bit of a puzzle still. I think religious attitudes currently have been a way by which people have made sense of not just their place in the world, but how the world is changing. But these have not been a major part of the way in which public life in the city has been shaped so far. These have mainly been private concerns through which people organize in terms of their families and communities. But it's not been, religious ideologies haven't played as strong a role in shaping struggles around poverty and issues of development. Though, of course, in India, Hindu nationalism has been a very big force in terms of shaping overall politics, in terms of the rights of Hindus as a majority community. But when it comes to questions about class and development, I think the role of religion has really not been as large as one might have expected it to be. But I think that's a very interesting question to think about, why that's been the case. Thanks.
Rona.
I'm thinking more largely about these discourses of environmentalism. I'm curious if you think that there are any connections between Northern and Southern environmentalism, in that Northern environmentalism is often rooted in consumption, and that we see here this push towards purchasing more fuel-efficient cars or reducing consumption of bottled water. But do you think that Southern environmentalism emerges separately from this discourse of Northern environmentalism? Or is it that actually Northern environmentalism provides a framework within which Southern environmentalists can work or operate within?
I think there are important connections between Northern and Southern environmentalism that often get overlooked when the two are just positioned as a contrast, as they are in some of the academic literature. I think environmentalism in the South has been very, very influential in getting the environmentalism of the North to also rethink, or the environmentalism of the North to rethink their own patterns of consumption and so on. But we must remember that the idea of Southern environmentalism actually emerged as a contrast to the way in which environmentalism had been thought of up to that point. And I'm referring here to the social movements of the 1970s in Europe as well as in North America, where environmentalism was very much seen as, saving the earth in a way that did not relate it to questions about disparities in terms of consumption, class inequalities, capitalism's workings, and so forth. So the question of equity and nature, or ecology and equity, had really not been put together as closely as they were when you had in the late 1970s and 1980s movements of environmentalism in the South, which made a claim to protecting the environment, but also at the same time said that the prior needs of the poor must shape how environments are used and managed. So if the environmentalism of the North was primarily about protection, of keeping aside wilderness areas, the environmentalism of the South was about creating productive landscapes, landscapes where poor people could farm, could collect forest produce, could raise their livestock, but in a manner and at a rate which would also result in the conservation of the environment. So in that sense, the environmentalism of the poor came about as a direct counter to the way in which environmentalism up to that point had been defined. And I think the fact that it was not just a sort of academic or conceptual argument, but was an argument that was actually lived out in the struggles of very poor people in, say, the Himalayan foothills, or people in the or rubber tappers in the Brazilian rainforest, or for that matter, people struggling against dams in India and Indonesia, gave it a particular potency in terms of its political edge, as well as the way in which it became compelling. So in that sense, I think the environmentalism of the poor then forced the North to reflect on its own practices and to think about what was going on within the North. And that's why I think that the subsequent wave of movements that have been called the environmental justice movements against the siting of, say, nuclear waste facilities, or generally, hazardous waste facilities, or dumping garbage, or the location of hazardous industries near places where poor black communities live. These sorts of issues then brought to the fore the questions of race and class, which had been asked by movements in the South as well. And I think that's when we see a redefinition in terms of environmentalism now talking about the global South, as opposed and recognizing that the South can also lie within industrialized countries in Europe or North America. Whereas I think earlier the South and the North had been thought of in continental terms, that the South was Asia, Africa, and Latin America, whereas the North was the industrialized world. But now one realizes that, in fact, the way capitalism has reconstituted the world, you could have pockets of deep poverty within the North as well. So with the idea of the global South, I think the definition of what an environmental question is and how it must be rooted and connected to questions of social justice became the most important way of defining the environment. But within that, I think it's important to recognize that the earlier strands of environmentalism in terms of wildlife conservation, or in terms of safeguarding a particular kind of aesthetic lifestyle, still persist. And that's why in the Indian case, bourgeois environmentalists really hark back to a vision of nature that shares something with the work of, say, somebody like John Muir, that it's about going back to a pristine nature as a place of spiritual fulfillment, as a place where you can enjoy the beauty of nature. And at the same time, it's about creating a living environment for oneself, which is gracious and green and is a place for a certain kind of consumption. And there is therefore a divorce between recognizing the landscapes of production, which are ugly, hazardous, where poor people happen to live and work, and separating them from one's own vision of what nature must be. So there's a kind of double think that happens, and a desire to delink one's everyday life from the ugliness of industrial capitalism and working people's lives, even though, of course, this desirable and gracious lifestyle is completely, underwritten and supported by all the nastiness and the mess which is being banished elsewhere.
We have a few questions. So, Rachel.
So I'm just really curious about, I guess, how sustainable the urban planning policies are in the long run for bourgeois environmentalism. in your opinion?
Okay, that's a very big question, and it's a difficult question because the complexities are manifold in the sense that there's a way in which even the mainstream dominant discourse of urban planning, um, speaks about environmental concerns. If you go to a planning school today or talk to practicing planners, many of them will actually say that, oh, we care about the environment and will bring in elements of, intelligent design, of trying to work with creating sustainable, building structures as well as with managing water or traffic and so on. The problem, however, is that much of this planning process happens in a vacuum, in the sense that the politics of the ways in which urban land is managed, the way in which the government works and has a vested interest in encouraging certain forms of real estate development or encouraging a certain kind of elite consumption, is something that gets shut out of the consciousness of planners when they're making their well-intentioned enlightened plans. And this becomes a serious disjunct in terms of what the plan actually says should be done and what then happens on the ground. So it's the ability of politics on the ground to affect the planning process and to bring about modifications that I think is key to the way in which successful planning is actually going to incorporate the concerns of the working class and their ideas about how cities can be made sustainable. And one way that this is happening in Delhi is that at least some slum dwellers organizations and small trade unions or vendors, etc., are coming together and saying, let's do the planning exercise of mapping who consumes what resources, who consumes urban space, how much water do we use, how much water do upper-class people use, what about the consumption of electricity, how much fuel do we consume, what kind of, what is our contribution to global warming and that of well-to-do people. And then when you're able to then show both the disparities in patterns of consumption, in the ecological footprint of different kinds of social groups, then they're able to then argue that you could have a plan for urban management which is geared to the needs of the poor and which would then result in a very different set of allocations in terms of city infrastructure and urban planning. And those are the kinds of things that people now have been saying for a few years now, at least a decade. And to the extent that there is some interest now in the media in picking up what people are saying about the rights of people who use non-motorized transport, the rights of small vendors, and so on. I think there's at least some discussion about these issues, even though they haven't yet made it into the planning discourse officially so far. I think what's also, what creates a certain potential for the future is the fact that with increasing migration and with this huge informal economy that sustains the city, there is an interest among certain politicians to try and think of ways in which they can actually address the concerns of these groups. At the end of the day, they have to get elected, and to that extent, they not only must, address the concerns of the big money that supports politicians, but they must also get the votes. And to that extent, we see this constant sort of double movement on the part of planners and politicians to try and accommodate some things that the working classes need or speak about, while at the same time making sure that the larger edifice of the larger business of economic liberalization goes on as usual. So it's trying to walk on both these legs that I think creates opportunities and room for maneuver right now as well as in the future.
Dr. Baviskar, our time is starting to run short, but we still have a number of questions, so perhaps we'll try and just squeeze two more into the remaining time that we have. So Aaron and then Pia.
So my series of questions concern...
Series?
Unfortunately, series of questions concern a sort of phantom concept in between violence and desire, and that is the concept of structural violence. And so, since 1969 in Galtung's definition of structural violence, it's this idea, right, that the social order, gender forces, economic forces, political forces can foreshorten life chances. And then Paul Farmer takes this up and seems to be emphasizing both history, economic forces, but also politics. And then recently, Philippe Bourgois is defining, 2011, is defining structural violence as basically only inherent in political economic forces. So we can't take the definition of structural violence for granted. It's a concept that is shifting and becoming more narrow. So my first question is, what is your definition of structural violence? And then I hope that the questions become more focused. So the next question is, what is the relationship between structural violence then, according to your definition, and space, particularly in Delhi? And then the final is, do you see a relationship, or can you spin some dynamism between structural violence and the death of 18-year-old Dilip, who was obviously, as you say, in the wrong place at the wrong time, but also it seems like he was embedded within sort of the wrong or a wrong social order.
Okay. I'll be very brief. I use structural violence in a very specific way, and that's to refer to actually this long-standing dilemma that a lot of social scientists as well as political organizers have had to deal with, which is this dilemma of how people negotiate a world of coercion and consent. Why do they consent to their own oppression? I mean, I remember as a grad student reading Michael Burawoy's work on this. And this is a question which is a long-standing and enduring one that concerns all of us. So I talk about structural violence in terms of the way in which, in some literature at least, on migration, it is presented as a clear-cut choice that people either move because of violence in the form of dispossession, or they move because of desire, because they want to go to a set of better opportunities. And I use the idea of structural violence to say that, in fact, desire is not any sort of clear-cut choice that people exercise, nor is consent. But the way in which life presents itself to people, the way in which so-called choices present them to people are actually not choices at all, but a series of compulsions that are summed up in the Hindi word majburi. People say that, we have no choice. And yet the migration debate still continues to talk about push and pull factors. So in the case of space in urban Delhi, I think that this aspect of the discourse, which says that people should go back to where they belong, that migrants should not be in the city at all, in fact refuses to recognize the way in which structural violence is at work in people's lives, so that what appear to be opportunities are in fact not opportunities at all, but as forms of coercion. In the case of the 18-year-old Dilip, who is killed by middle-class homeowners because he happens to use a piece of land to defecate upon, he has no other, there are no toilets in the squatter settlement that he's visiting. I think that violence actually makes visible what is an implicit and underlying violence in most relationships across classes in Delhi. To me, it was just a dramatization of what is going on in all kinds of other ways as well. And the question really is, why do people put up with that violence? Why do they consent to their own degradation in the ways that they do? Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have time for one last quick question. Pia?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for an interesting talk and some very great articles. I think you show very well in your paper how the question of like labor struggle merges and intersect with the question of struggle over space and resources, the environment, and it turns out to be like a general class struggle. And in terms of the environmental struggle, which I think in all these cases it's difficult to like isolate it to the environment. You describe how the poor comes to stand very much against this bourgeoisie class or the middle class. You lay out there is a different interest, and this is what it ends. But I'm thinking about, like, in the end, the interest of these two groups, if we're thinking of the bourgeoisie as the middle class, like, must intersect at some points, like in terms of, for an example, work conditions, that you don't want to work in a polluted factory, but you don't want to have polluted factories either. And also in terms of, like, proper housing. So I wanted to know, are there any, like, concrete expressions of these interests actually also meeting in terms of, like, organizing?
Do you mean middle class interests organizing, or do you mean the convergence of different interests?
I mean, if we also see in terms of the urban struggle that middle class interest meets with the poor interest, because as far as I see, they have their interest intersect at some points in terms of environmentalism. So do we see any like concrete expressions of the struggles meeting?
Yeah. When it comes to urban issues, right now, empirically, no. But I think on other issues right now in India, there's a huge amount of ferment. And even as I'm speaking, there's in the last week been, this is, in the month of April 2011, there's been a huge struggle where middle class groups, religious groups as well, have come together with poor people in rural India to, in fact, charge the government with corruption and to argue that there need to be safeguards in place to make sure that there's oversight, citizens' oversight over corrupt government officials and politicians. So not on the issue of the environment yet, but on other kinds of issues which seem to affect everybody in different aspects of their life. And corruption of the government is certainly something that does touch people's lives in several ways across the board. And that has now become an issue that has brought together people. It's an extremely complex, contradictory, and I think quite exciting set of things going on in India right now around the question of corruption. And a lot of people who want to understand these movements in terms of being able to slot them in particular kinds of ideological ways, etc., are completely stumped because these movements don't fit our ideas of what progressive politics is. They don't fit the kinds of class expectations we have about how people should come together. So I think there's a richness to these kinds of movements which both causes perplexity, but I think in the end should ultimately just make us think more and think more deeply about the potentials as well as pitfalls of what is happening right now.
Right.
So sadly, we are out of time, but we'd like to really thank you, Dr. Baviskar, for taking the time to be with us today and for making these really important contributions to this discussion. Thank you.